I don't know if there's ever been a better song written for a voice than that song was written for Laura. She did an incredible job with that. My goodness, holy moly, that was incredible. I want to ask you this morning to think about if there has ever been a time in your life, maybe at a job interview or maybe a first date or something of that nature, that you really tried to impress someone and it flopped. You don't have to explain it. I don't want to embarrass anybody, but does anyone ever have a story like that you'd raise your hand and say, that happened to me a little? Yeah, I think it's happened to most of us. For me, it was one of my first ever solo dates. I was 16 and I did what all kids in the 90s would have done. We went to the mall and we went to Sbarro's Pizza. And we got 2 pieces of pizza and a soda, and then we were going to go to a movie, because there was a time when malls still had movie theaters. And what happened is, as I was taking the pizza on the tray over to, and I know that you all are already starting to picture this, me and my clumsy big feet biffed it. And I ended up with pizza all over the bottom of my pants, soda all over my shoes, and all over the floor. And to make matters worse, I had only brought enough money to buy the pizza and 1 drink and then the movie tickets. So not only was I wearing it all through the movie, but we didn't get to eat dinner. And I don't know if that kind of thing has happened to any of y'all, but my guess is that most of us at some point in our life have tried really hard to impress somebody and then just biffed it. You know, I think about this a lot, about how we try to impress other people, and whether we try to impress just other people or whether we try to impress God or the divine. I think a lot of our lives are spent trying to measure up to what we think is the right end objective. When I was a pastor down in Tucson, we used to have this thing a couple of times a year where we'd have dinner, and people could just kind of do a Q&A, and we'd ask some questions, and they'd ask some questions. And one of the first questions that we would always ask to kick this off was, if there was a God, and you could ask that divine being, whatever it is, any question, what would you ask? And the number one question that was asked time and time and time again was, am I doing okay? Do you like what I see? In other words, am I impressive to you? Over the summer, we are exploring this thought as we are looking at this series called The Good Place, What Happens When We Die? And kind of asking this like larger, almost like existential question, right? Of like, is whatever there is out there, we here at the venues often call it God or the divine, and you may be sitting here and you're like, Chris, I don't believe in any of that. And let me just say, I am so happy that you're here, regardless of what that belief system looks like. And so if as I say this, you think, do I impress the concept of love? Do I follow that path? That's perfectly fine. But I think so many of us in this large question ask, am I doing okay? Am I impressing? Am I making an impact on the world around me? And in the show, The Good Place, there is this character that Elizabeth mentioned earlier named Tahani Al-Jamil. And one of the things throughout this show, even in her afterlife, that she has a big habit of doing is trying to impress other people by name-dropping celebrities that she knows, which I think is a fairly common thing. Like, people try to relive the best stories of their life. And so actually just a year or so ago, NBC put together a mashup of some of her most spectacular, let's call them humble brags, where she talks about the people that she's met. And I want to give you just a second to catch up with this. So we'll take a second and see this video. Yeah, I don't know if you've ever met someone like that, though, who's always willing to kind of name drop, or they're really happy to do the right thing as long as the right person sees them do it, right? Maybe you have that coworker where every time the boss walks through, all of a sudden they look really busy, and you know that they're just goofing around the rest of the time. Or you see the politician who swings in just to get the photo op and then leaves. Or the people who are happy to go to places and take pictures with kids that they would never vote to protect. I'll let that settle for a second. But today, As we hone in on this question of why we do the things that we do, is why we try to impress other people, I want to kind of give you this overarching framework that we're going to be working with throughout the teaching, and that's this: that when everyone is trying to impress everyone, true love is shown by making an impact, not just an impression. Okay? And we're going to spend some time unpacking that, but I want to say it again because there's a lot here, and I want to start with this statement that when everyone is trying to impress everyone, true love is shown by making an impact, not just an impression. You see, there are times and ways that we will see people do the right thing for the wrong reason, or we'll see them do the wrong thing for the right reason. And this morning, what I want us to kind of do is figure out how to marry those two to where we're doing the right thing for the right reason. Tahani, when she's alive, spends a lot of her life doing a lot of the right things. But the reason seems to be that she's always living in the shadow of her sister. Her sister is one of those people who it seems like everything she did, she was spectacular at. And there's actually a Greek word for those type of people. It's annoying. I don't know if you've ever met someone like that. I had a really good friend in middle school who was like this. Like, the first time he ever ran hurdles, he set our school record. He had his first hole-in-one before he was a sophomore in high school. He was a beautiful-looking human being who could date anyone that he wanted to. He was brilliant. And him and I still are pretty okay friends to this day. But we may know those people who just seem like they're great at everything. And you see, Tahani does a lot of the things that she does in her life for this purpose. And she does a lot of good things too, right? She hosts charity dinners and fundraisers, and she serves on charity boards. But the reason that she does all of them is to try to gain the approval of her parents, who see her sister and want her to kind of measure up. Interestingly enough, in the Christian Bible, there is a story that is very, very similar to this. And it shows up in the book of Matthew, which if you had a Bible and you were looking through it in the New Testament, it's the very first book in the New Testament. And it's a story about this guy who had two sons. And we're going to kind of look at the ways that they tried to measure up to what their dad was saying. So it shows up in Matthew chapter 21, it starts in verse 28. And Jesus is talking here, and I want you to hear what he says. He starts off by saying, what do you think about this? A man with two sons told the older boy, "Son, go out and work in the vineyard today." And the son answered, "No, I won't go." But later he changed his mind and went anyway. And then the father told the other son, "You go." And he said, "Yes, sir, I will." But he didn't go. And my guess is that if you have two or more children of your own, or if you've ever worked with students or with children, I used to be a teacher, and you may have experienced this kind of thing before. You look at them and you're like, you were both raised the same way. Like, you had the same environment, you had the same people around you. I asked you both the same thing, and yet you turned out so differently. How did that happen? Well, I think that there is a reason that this happens, and I want to start looking at that with this thought, that oftentimes when presented with new information, we try to make a good impression, okay? That oftentimes when presented with new information, we try to make a good impression. You see, one thing that I had never noticed before about this story of the man with his two sons is that the dad didn't ask the sons to go work in the vineyard. He told them, "I need you to go do this." And it was actually their reactions that seemed so different, both at first glance and then under further investigation. And I do want to note before we go too far that, by the way, there was nothing wrong initially with even what the second son said. His dad said, "I need you to go work," and he said, "Yes, I'll do that." But it's actually what happens and the motivations behind that that shows that there's something much more at play. I wonder how often we find ourselves in the shoes of the second son, right? Someone tells us something, and we don't want to cause a conflict or make people think less of us. We want to save face. And so we do this thing where we'll just agree to whatever they say, right? It's like, my guess is yesterday, as many of y'all I know were at things like the No Kings protest or at Pride Fest, and you were marching around, and you're like, we should do this kind of stuff all the time. And then we don't, right? Or when you'd get back from summer camp as a kid and you'd exchange phone numbers or addresses when you were still writing letters, and you'd be like, we should write each other all the time. And we never do we? Because sometimes there's this idea that we just want to save face. But it's possible that sometimes this can go even further. I wonder how often we find ourselves in the shoes of both the second son and in Tahani, where we try to make a good impression, mostly because it makes us feel better. There's been a lot of research lately around this concept called virtue signaling. I don't know how many of y'all are familiar with this term. Basically, it's this idea that means that sometimes we do things publicly because we think the people that we want to impress want to see us doing a certain good thing. And so we do things to try to show that we're in alignment with them. And while most authors think there's nothing intrinsically wrong with doing those things independently, because it does things like it raises awareness about major problems, and it helps change the collective opinion about things, at times, it can also be problematic. Tariq Killian is a postdoctoral researcher at the University of Edinburgh, and I want you to hear what he recently wrote about virtue signaling. Virtue signaling often consists of completely costless actions, such as changing your profile picture or saying you don't like a politician's stance on immigration. Dishonesty is a major problem in the moral domain. People want to appear good because it wins them friends and social status. Signaling can have positive effects, expanding our domain of moral concern to issues that would otherwise be conveniently ignored. But it can often lead people to hold beliefs that are increasingly disconnected from reality. Unfortunately, the moralization of such ideals can be very damaging. And you might be sitting there thinking, look, Chris, what's the big deal if I put up a pride flag on my Facebook profile picture, or if I do something like that? Isn't human rights, isn't that something that we should do everything we can to draw attention to? Well, of course. But part of the thing is that the people who see us the most often learn to trust us. And so sometimes when our actions don't match our words, it can be doubly harmful. For example, here at the venues, we say that we're all about affirmation and inclusion. But if we never gave a microphone to a woman to speak, our actions wouldn't match our words, which is doubly harmful. Because first, we say that we're going to do something, and systems are oppressive, and then the people who think they can trust us find out that we're not really trustworthy. So it's doubly harmful. It's one of the reasons here that we work so hard at the venues to vet the people who we host on our venues.org/counseling website. Philip and I are not counselors, okay? And we don't try to be. That is not our lane. A lot of pastors have done that, and it's been really harmful for people. Mental health, though, is a real thing, and people should do the things that they need to do to take care of themselves mentally. And so we have a site where we have personally vetted counselors who are not going to try to corner you into a position or use schemas that aren't helpful to try to help you develop patterns and principles that you can use to deal with mental health crises. In the same way that if you broke an arm, you wouldn't go to your pastor and be like, can you fix this? You shouldn't do that if you're having a mental health crisis either. We can do things like spiritual guidance, but mental health is beyond that. So we spend a lot of time and energy making sure that the people that we have here have been vetted to make sure that they don't doubly hurt people. You know, one of the complications of when we make these kind of impressions, though, is this, that they are nearly impossible to fact check until you're involved in it. I know this is going to be ironic, given that I'm literally sitting on a stage talking to people. But it's pretty easy to impress people from a distance, sitting on stage, saying big words and name dropping people, right? I can impress people that way. And people can be really duped that way. But I wonder, maybe that's not actually how we impress God. Maybe that's not actually how we follow the path of love. Father Richard Rohr says this about this text, and I think it was so insightful. He says, Jesus says there are two kinds of people. There are those who say all the right words, but they don't do anything about it. And there's other people who appear to disagree, but they do something. And Jesus says he prefers the second. In other words, you all know the phrase, actions speak louder than words. You know we live in a country that is completely and entirely opinionated. We're simply divided into tribes, and truth doesn't really matter. It's just, you've got to be loyal to your tribe, whatever that tribe is, black or white, Catholic or Protestant, Republican or Democrat. And after a while, truth means almost nothing. And as long as we keep joining these tribes of disagreement, Rohr says, I see little future for America. It's pretty harrowing. You know, it makes me wonder, and I could be wrong about this, but it makes me wonder if maybe Jesus isn't really all that impressed by the words that we say, but is way more impressed by the actions that we undertake. I wonder if, just like Rohr says, if one of the underlying problems in the US today is that we are too quick to try to impress people by having the immediate right answer instead of spending the time and contemplation to make sure not that we're just over-opinionated, but that we're actually involved. And that the flaw is that keeps creating division. Look, I get it. It is easy right now to be overwhelmed. Companies are spending billions and billions of dollars trying to get our eyeballs to go to the things that they want us to see. And sometimes when overwhelm is the point, focus is the best way that we can create resistance. It seems like we oftentimes just look for someone who kind of fits one of our models and say, like, whatever they say, I'll just do. But maybe what Jesus says here is actually there's a third way that's way better. And I want you to hear what he says after he tells the story about the two sons. It says he asked this question. He said, which of the two obeyed his father? And the religious leaders who had been listening to him said, the first. Interestingly to me, while we read this in English as who obeyed the father, a better translation would probably be who did the father's desire. And while that might not seem like a big difference in English, almost every time in Greek, which is what the New Testament was written in, that it uses the phrase, who did the father's desire, it's not talking about an earthly father, it's talking about God. Because remember, in that world, they were incredibly patriarchal, and the only pronouns that they used for God were he and him for the most part. And so when they were saying this, it's possible that what they were saying is, who followed the path of love that God laid out for all of us? The one who said, I'll do it, but didn't, or the one who said, I won't do it, but did. And I think that when we hit that nexus point, it's actually when we have the choice that what we do moving forward. And so that's the last big thing I want to talk about today, and that's this. That if we have the choice, we should choose impact over impression. That if we have the choice, we should choose impact over impression. And I know those two words look a lot alike. They're very similar. But I do think there are some differences that both show up in the text and also show up in the way that we just explore the text and experience this that make a big difference in how these things play out. The first of which is this, that impression is concerned with the short-term immediate results, while impact is concerned with the long-term lasting results. You know, we often hear that we never get a second chance to make a good first impression. And I think that's true, but I think that it's much deeper than that. Impressions are often focused on the short-term impacts of what's happening around us. Here, the second son tried to make the quick short-term impression. Hey, Dad, I'm going to do exactly what you said. But it was actually the first son who did the long-term piece of making sure it was taken care of. We see this around us all the time, right? It is super impressive to see the really hot celebrity couple, right? Who both have great bodies and they fly around on private jets and have millions of dollars to spend walking up and down the beach and taking perfect Instagram photos. And that's really impressive. But you know what's really impactful to me? It's the people who have committed their life to each other for decades and decades and decades, and who at 98, maybe they don't know the newest TikTok dance, but they still open the door for each other. And they know, by the way, they know that when the doctor comes around in the hospital and says visiting hours are over, that doesn't apply to them. Let's choose impact, because that is impactful. They have chosen to make the long-term investment, to choose impact. You know, here at the venues, we could really impress people, right? We could choose to do things like partner with organizations all over the world, and we could fill up our social media feed with all kinds of pictures. But instead, we've chosen to make an impact where every single dollar that you give here stays in the 417, right? We choose to be here for the long haul. I love the fact that we choose one school that we partner with, because all teachers are heroes, but we choose to say there's a group of teachers that don't have a PTA around them, so we'll come together and support them. I love that we do that with Studio Alternative Center. Yeah, that's awesome. Thank you. You do that. Thank you. I love the fact that we have people who every single Thursday night and every single Friday morning feed our unsheltered friends. Every single week, because we choose to make an impact, because we see them face to face. And I love the fact that we partner with organizations here in Springfield, like Crosslines, where our women's warriors just recently got together and packaged boxes and boxes and boxes of feminine hygiene products, because period poverty is a real thing, and we can make an impact on it here. So thank you for all of you who participate in those things to make an impact in the 417, because it's really important, because that's how we take care of the long-term, lasting effects, not just the short-term effects. But it's not just the short-term piece. The second thing is that it has to do with impression is focused on the words that we say, while impact is focused on the actions that we take. You see, when Jesus was telling this story, he finishes it by blowing the minds of the religious leaders who said that the Son actually did the work of God. I want you to see what he said. It says, then Jesus explained his meaning, which is something Jesus doesn't do very often, by the way. He said this. He said, I tell you the truth, corrupt tax collectors and prostitutes will get into the kingdom of God before you do. For John the Baptist came and showed you the right way to live, the behaviors, but you didn't believe him. While tax collectors and prostitutes did, and even when you saw this happening, you refused to believe him and repent of your sins. This would have been so shocking to the religious leaders of the day. Here were these religious leaders, and Jesus was saying to them that the people whom no one respected are the ones who bring the kingdom of God to earth. What it says here is that Jesus says that they didn't believe John at all. In the context, it seems to say that the sex workers and those who were deemed the most corrupt changed and lived in the way that aligned themselves with the path of love, the path of God. While the religious leaders were just really interested in making sure that everyone was following the exact path that they had. They were concerned about arguing about, did you tithe enough off of the dill that you picked in your garden? Did you do enough? Did you follow all of the rules exactly the same way? It seems like the religious leaders of the day were much more concerned with purity test. Do you align fully with every single thing? Then are you following the path of God that God has laid out in front of you, the path of love? You know, a couple of years ago, there was a lot of conversation nationally about what we should do about our healthcare process here in the United States. We look around and we say, it's broken, right? That doesn't, by the way, at all have anything to do with the doctors or the nurses. They're incredible heroes. But the system is broken. And so there were all of these debates. Do we do Medicare for all? Do we do Medicare for all who want it? Do we do some kind of universal basic health care? What do we do about that? And there were some people who were saying, look, it's either all or I don't want to be involved in it at all. The problem with that is that sometimes that leaves out voices that are really important. I want you to hear from a voice that would have often been oppressed in this conversation, an individual by the name of Shaniqua McClendon, and what she had to say about this, because I think it was so important. She said, going back to the privilege piece, A lot of what I hear when I hear people who are kind of engaging in purity politics is, well, I'm speaking up for those whose voices are not heard in all of this. And I guarantee you, if you spoke to someone whose voice was not heard and they had to choose healthcare, they'd take whichever one they could get. I think people should have convictions about the things that they believe in, but I just know that there are people who look like me who get sacrificed in these conversations of all or nothing. Look, it is super impressive to say things with moral clarity, and there are definitely things that we believe that you should say with moral clarity, right? Homophobia is always wrong. Transphobia is always wrong. Racism is always wrong. And there may be other individual things in your life that you say are always right or always wrong because of the experiences that you have, and that's dynamite, right? But there are many times, I think, where our value of intellectual humility causes us to have a tension between multiple things and say, I don't know how I deal with this, right? That maybe we need to figure out ways to work with people to make sure that tangible needs are met. Things like getting health care for everyone. Things like making sure that women's rights are protected. That we have to work together to make sure those things get accomplished. Let me be very clear. There are hungry people and people without shelter here in Springfield. I do not care who is involved in solving those, as long as the problem gets solved. If the meals get cooked by people at the venues, awesome. If they get cooked by an evangelical church, awesome. Or a Buddhist temple, or people of the Baha'i faith tradition, a bunch of atheists, or some really rich business owners. I don't care. All that matters is that hungry people get food. Right. And it's amazing what can happen if no one cares who gets the credit. If no one cares that a sermon is preached, but we care about the fact that people have food to put in their mouth, it changes the whole conversations. But sometimes that's a little easier said than done. And this is the final thing that I want to share about. The difference between impact and impression is this, that impression is something that can be done from far away, while impact is best done in close proximity. In The Good Place, Tahani gets asked to tell Eleanor about all the things that she did while she was alive. And I want you to take a look at what she says. Yeah. You know, at the end there, I think it really summarizes the whole thing, right? We can get congratulations beautiful from a distance. Like Eleanor in this space only saw the things that Tahani had done from a distance. But none of the things that Tahani did made a difference in Eleanor's life at all. You see, it is possible to make an impact from a different distance. Let me be really honest. If you're watching this online right now and you're like, I just have $100 million burning a hole in my pocket, we would love to use that to make a difference here in Springfield. And you can write the check to the Venues Church and we'd be happy to use that. But there is also a piece here about how when we follow the heart of love, when we follow the heart of God, that a lot of times it means getting our fingers dirty, right? The first son literally went to the vineyard and pulled the grapes off and did the thing, not just talked about doing the thing. And I wonder how we figure out if that's actually what we're doing or not. Maybe there's a piece here about finding out what's more important. And a good way to check that is to think about how the people closest to you would answer that question, right? What would maybe my kids say about it? Or my partner, or the people that I live with, or the people that I work most closely with? You know, I've been very fortunate that today as we think about Father's Day, I've been so fortunate to have a dad who very much embodied this idea and still does. You see, while he impressed a lot of people, he was a pastor, he could say the big words, I saw how he impacted me because he also worked a second job at a steel factory, and every day after he would get done, he would come home and play catch with me. And that impacted me. You see, while Father's Day is complicated, fully, it's a really complicated holiday for so many, I think there's a model here that is the path that Jesus walked. You see, Jesus spent most of his time on earth around about a dozen ragtag individuals, people that he could impact. And while there were definitely stories about him doing miracles for thousands, and those were undoubtedly impressive, the people who spent their entire life around him were impacted to such an incredible degree that I think that we could model. It's one of the reasons, by the way, that we think connection groups like Bar Church or like the Dinners for Eights that we have going on this summer are so important. You can come in on a Sunday morning and say everything is fine and we'll believe you in 3 or 4 seconds. But when you see other people eyeball to eyeball every single week, there's something that changes about that, right? When you know that things are different. And if you're not connected to Bar Church, come on Thursday night. We're at Mother's Brewing every week at 6:30. Or talk to Josh about joining a Dinners for Eight group this summer. It's a great way to meet other people and make connections. But ultimately, here's the last thing I want to say, and that's this. We'll probably all continue in our lives trying to impress people because it's part of being a human. Sometimes we'll biff it and spill pizza all over our pants. But maybe we should start measuring ourselves by how much we impact people, because I think that's a much bigger way to really make a difference for the world around us. By the way, one of the ways that we choose to impact people here is through the Q&A. If you have questions as we've done this, there's not quite enough time today for us to get through this because I only have like 30 seconds left. But if you have questions, I would love to buy you a cup of coffee or a beer and sit down and talk about a question that you have. And we can do that eyeball to eyeball. We don't have to do that over the internet or anything like that. Because we want to continue to make impacts with each other, because we get better when you ask questions and we can share those thoughts together. Okay? So I just want to thank you so much for doing that with us here this morning.